All right, so we got Fletcher's LDD here. The first few pieces look solid to me. The theme is definitely appropriate and fits within the scraps vision. Overall, your goal looks solid. You got a solid paragraph here explaining what it is you're supposed to get. So it looks like there's some lost recordings and plans to take over the city before the big apocalypse hit. So we need to actually find. It looks like we need to find those items, right? We need to find those recordings and get those items to then save the citizens. Featured asset looks like a solid choice. It's um, the large object in the level itself, a 3-level ship. So I'm definitely looking for in the featured asset description here a way that it's interactive or a way that it's going to be tied to player progression. So definitely, just by looking at the image, I can get some ideas of how you could interact with this thing or how it's going to be interactive. But make sure you explain that in the description. Overall, great image though. We definitely want the featured asset to be one obstacle or one object in the level that stands out and can be used as a visual landmark. An alternative way to think about the featured asset as well is like some obstacle or problem that the player needs to solve. So if my goal is to locate these lost recordings and then they plant and plans, those could be located somewhere on the ship, right? Or they could be located within the level, and there's something they need to do on the ship to then overcome that obstacle and then accomplish that goal. All right, so good start with those. So it looks like your two mechanics you have are explosive objects. So it looks like there will be drums of oil scattered along the shipyard and ship. These drums will be used to clear the path for the player. They'll also be used to access certain rooms. All right, so in this description right here, I'm not seeing how you actually interact with them. So where these are listed, note 1, note 2, this is where you want to explain those rules and try to think of all the corner cases. So, and be super detailed, right? Like imagine you're handing this off to another designer and they're going to build this explosive object based on this description right here, and that's it. So if you want the barrels to like respawn in certain areas, maybe there's a little truck, right? And the truck's pickup, the back of the pickup is open up, and once you take a barrel out, once that barrel is destroyed, then another one respawns, right? That's a small detail of the rule of how that mechanic's going to work. So try to think of things like that, and also just explain here what the actual interaction is. So it seems like based on your setups that I'm using it with the Gravnol. So in here, you'd want to explain the player can pick up these explosive drums with the Gravnol and they can throw them. When they hit certain objects or specific things with the velocity, they will explode, etc., etc. So make sure in here is where you're describing how the mechanic works. Then down below, in your IPM setups, we want to describe those specific gameplay elements. So here you're saying the player will receive notification on screen when approaching the item. Then it looks like your concept for the practice and mastery is to start to remove that in-game feedback. So I understand the thought process why you want to do so as a way to make it more challenging, but oftentimes that leaves the player feeling a bit confused or like the feedback is inconsistent. So try to find a way to actually make the gameplay interaction different, how things are positioned. Also with your objects that you're interacting with, so it looks like your other mechanic is destructible objects, which we're going to get to. I'm going to review that part. But a way that you can tie all of your explosives together is you can say oil drums can blow up wooden objects. So if you say that in the rules, then your introduced practice and mastery, you can be interacting with those specific objects, or you're throwing the barrels at specific wooden objects. So if they have the consistent material, what that object is could be different. It could be a crate, it could be scaffolding, it could be wooden beams that you blow up to drop and make a bridge or make a walkway. So all of those little details. So try to explain from the player's perspective what they do. So here you're telling me I get a notification, but what am I doing? Do I pick up the barrel and throw it at a wall and the wall blows up? Do I pick up the barrel and throw it at the ceiling and part of the ceiling blows up and falls down? Like, what does the player actually do? So your gameplay interactions should explain from the player's eyes what I'm doing. So if my mechanic was pressure plates, when I place objects on them, the doors open, you would say the player sees a box high up on a ledge. They can jump up to the ledge to get it. They pick up the object with the grapnel, carry it over to the pressure plate, and set it on the pressure plate. When they do so, the player sees the door open. So you see all of that detail. As I described that, you can visualize the player doing that. But when I read yours, it just says the player will receive a notification on screen that doesn't fully tell me what the interaction is. What's the gameplay using your mechanic? All right. So your second mechanic that you chose was destructible objects. So there'll be different things throughout the level that the player needs to basically destroy. So it looks like here you are interacting with the oil drums. And again, you're having the same concept here where you're starting to remove player feedback. So I'm not going to repeat myself on that. But one thing I want to point out to you is from the first session, we talked about the breakdown here. So we want each interaction, each mechanic should have a core action, some mechanic that they're using. All right, and let me show you the 3 core actions we provide you guys. So each mechanic should use one of these core actions. So it looks like for one of your mechanics, you already have it. You pick up your explosive oil drums with the grapnel and throw them. Right? So each mechanic should use one of these core actions. Also, there needs to be some interactive object that you're interacting with. So in both of your setups, it's the barrel/wall or barrel/object that you're interacting with, right? Pick up the barrel, throw it, and the success event would be the object being destroyed. So right now, how I'm reading it, these 2 mechanics are actually one mechanic, right? Because it's use the grapnel to pick up the barrel. So you see here our core action is pick up with the grapnel. The interactive object is the barrel. And then the success event is the object being destroyed that the barrel touched. So you have one mechanic, but now you want to definitely go back and see what you can do to come up with a second mechanic that could use something in support. All right, so try to choose something that uses a different core action. That's my recommendation. So you could have something based on the E key interaction. So you walk up to something and press E, and something happens in result. I'll also leave you with this slide where we talked about the provided interactive objects, which are accessible and definitely more than applicable to what we're doing. So you can walk up to the mechanical lever and press E. You can place objects on the pressure plate in the switch panel using the grapnel or movement from the player. So see what you can come up with and brainstorm ideas for another mechanic. And don't forget about IPTM, where you can twist them together. So if you want to come up with a setup using exploding barrels and pressure plates, and you combine them together in some way, that's definitely possible to do. All right. So anybody else want me to take a look at their LDD before I start talking about the bubble diagram? I will do one more, and then if anyone wants to meet after the recorded session, I'd be more than happy to go over yours one-on-one. Any other takers right now? Oh, you're welcome, Fletcher. Hope you got something from that, and if you want to go back, this is going to be recorded. Alrighty. So if not, I'm going to move on for now. But if you would like some more feedback, I'd be more than happy to continue to give you some throughout the week. So reach out to me if you want any feedback. Or if you've gotten feedback from one of your peers and you want some clarity, you want another opinion, myself or Anthony would be more than happy to help you with that. All right, so here's the calendar for week 2. The two main focuses for the week are the bubble diagram and the control station. So the control station is the technical task. I always encourage you guys to just work on the technical tasks early in the week. Get those knocked out. It shouldn't be super time consuming. You should be able to do it in one day or one work session, but give yourself time. Definitely be able to come up with something creative, as well as if you have any questions throughout the week, we'll be able to assist you with that, and get your messages answered faster during the week rather than waiting towards the weekend. So the control station, let me just pull that up. Excuse me, I have to take this. I'll be 1 minute. Alrighty, I'm sorry about that. I'm having some issues with my air conditioning in my car. Not a good time of year for that in Florida. So the control station, let me jump back to the assignment. There's just one main thing. I'm going to spend most of this time talking about the um, bubble diagram itself, but one important thing I want to point out about the control station is the main takeaways for the assignment are, one, first and foremost, that you get practice with ProBuilder. That's what I want everyone to really be focused on for this assignment. So you can definitely go through and follow the instructions, and build the control station that you see me going through. So I'll go through the steps, and I'll be teaching you ProBuilder and teaching you some basics about it. So if you follow through the construction, let me go down to the bottom here, you'll be left with something like this, right? Or you'll be left with this. And then if you want to add more pieces or add more of your own customization, feel free to do so. If you get through that and you want more, or you want to build your own control station, another big takeaway from this assignment is just finding reference images and using those reference images to recreate your objects. So even if you think you know what objects look like, in the past I had a student that pretty much had made the comment about, like, oh, I've worked in a warehouse, so I know what a forklift looks like. So, even if you think you know what something looks like, still use reference. It really helps with scale and proportion. So you can see here, these were reference images from a previous student example, to where he had two different images. One image was the main purpose, was the chair and the actual seat that the player would be in. And then the other reference image was like the actual console or the station. So you can see it's not exactly 100% the same, but it gave the designer or the creator of this a starting point, something to look at, and something to reference. And you can see the in-game final is pretty good, right? It doesn't match exactly, but it gives you a starting point. So that's a really big takeaway. So remember, as you're going through this assignment, if yours isn't looking just like the pictures or it isn't matching exactly, just focus on what you're making in the editor. Look at that, and does that look good? Do your best to make something and create something that's compelling and interesting. And I also challenge you, once you're finished, to try and block out and build your featured asset. Just roughly get the scale and proportion correct and get that size and make a recognizable silhouette. All right. So again, you'll see each one of these technical tasks has 3 main bullets that you should look out for. Three things I'm going to be looking for in the actual assignment when I grade them. So you're adding your materials to the control station folder. Make sure you submit your scene after each experiment. So we're going to go through this process of check out the scene, edit it, and make changes to it. And then whenever you save in Unity, you submit to Perforce. And then you just repeat that process over and over and over again till you hit a deadline, right? That's the work cycle that you'll go through when you get to the industry and even when you get later on and furthered into this project. So make sure you submit the scene after construction and then after you add materials and textures. And then lastly, the build that was added for project setup, you're going to delete that build and replace it with a build that includes your control station. All right, so those are the three main bullets, the main things I'm going to be looking for. So be sure to double check that list, and the assignment will walk you through all three of these. But definitely make sure you double check, and if something's unclear about one of these, definitely reach out to me, and I'd be more than happy to clarify that. All right, Chelsea, I did see your question about the technical issues you're having, and we will definitely screen share once we get through the bubble diagram stuff, and I'll take a look at what you're running into. All right, so the bubble diagram, right? This assignment is the middle ground in between the initial design you created and then the map that you're going to be making, right? So what's the point? What's the purpose of making your bubble diagram? Well, the purpose is to worry about the flow and the progression that the player is going to experience without worrying about what each part of the level looks like, right? So we're able to build this flow and build this process without being concerned with the visuals, right? What we want to focus on first and foremost as a game designer is the experience. What is the interaction? What's the fun thing that the player is going to be doing? Then later on in the map is when we're going to add in those smaller details. Let me turn my pointer on so you guys should be able to see that now. All right, so a few helpful tips about the bubble diagram is make any adjustments, make any changes to your LDD before you start. So I gave some feedback to Fletcher. You might get some feedback from your peers. Again, feel free to reach out to me if you want more additional feedback, but make any updates, make any changes to your design before you start, right? Know that you are able to make changes to your LDD. This is an ever-changing process. Next up, make a few different variations of the layout of your level, right? Elaborate and brainstorm a few different ways your level could actually experience, right? So as an example, say you know my level's set in an office building and it's going to be a 3-story building. So you might think to yourself, all right, well, I'm going to have the player walk into the building, they go up to the 3rd floor, and they take an elevator down and leave out the 1st floor, right? So I kind of have that. I'm building the level. I'm coming up with the layout. But then ask yourself, could the level be any different if the player starts on the roof? Maybe they get flown in and dropped off by a helicopter, and then they work their way down the building, so they don't have to go all the way up and then all the way down again. Or maybe they start out on the ground floor, and they climb up the outside of the building somehow and then work their way down. So just by reorganizing and repositioning the bubbles, it might help you come up with a better flow of the level, and then you can finalize that version. And then, of course, just like I mentioned above, don't worry about the aesthetics. The bubble diagram isn't the portfolio piece, it's the template, it's your skeleton to actually create the map itself. So here's just a really, really simple version of a bubble diagram, just so you can understand how it can be helpful and how this is used. It's used very commonly in the game industry as well as in architecture, which level design pulls a lot from architecture. So here is a study showing a bubble diagram of just somebody's house and their plan for their yard or their property. And then over here in these studies, study A and B, this would be the equivalent of your map, right? So you can see here's the lawn, here's that little planting bed, here are all those little spaces accounted for. But notice how this is a much more finalized layout. Here we have the size of the patio roughly that we want it to be. Here you can see the shed is the same size, just in a slightly different position. Same thing, the vegetable garden, slightly different size, slightly different shape, but overall takes up the same amount of space. So you can see the bubble diagram is a starting point. It's meant to change, it's meant to evolve to come up with the finalized design. All right, so here's here's a real world example of a bubble diagram. This was from the Tulsa Zoo project. So here is a bubble diagram I found of their initial plans for the zoo. So you can see different areas, different zones of the park broken down into either different continents in the world, or even just things like breaking it down into like the offices or like a service area, right? So just planning out where these zones are going to go. As we go forward, we look at like a midpoint. This would be where you guys would have your bubble diagram and start to make a map. Here you can still see the bubbles, but then underneath you start to see those details of the actual architecture. So you can see the buildings, you can see where walkways are going to be, even details like the parking lot and the overall size of it. This is where we start to work on scale and proportion, making things are the correct size that we want them to be. And then finally, here is the finished plans, right? So the red path is like the walking path that the user would go on, the different exhibits, and you can see this is a much more finalized plan that they can then start construction from. All right, and here's all three of those side by side, so you can showcase and see how it changes and evolves while still maintains the general shape and general size from the bubble diagram. This also is really handy for making any changes, right? Imagine you make the one all the way on the right, and then you show it to your boss, and they're like, oh yeah, actually we've decided to move the African plains up and switch it with North America. So go ahead and just move all that for us. And that's just a lot of work, right? It's a lot of time to redo all those things you just made. So then instead you show them the bubble diagram, so if they make a change like that, it's quick and easy for you to just reposition the bubbles before you spend all the time finalizing the design. So the bubble diagram gives us a good sense of the size of the level and the size of the space before we take all the time to add in all the smaller details that make it look pretty and give us a better plan for implementation. All right, so how do you start the bubble? How do you actually begin working on it? All right, well, first off, I recommend creating your actual bubbles, okay? And think of a bubble in your level as just an interactive space, an area in which something in the level happens. All right? So it doesn't necessarily have to be a room. I don't want you to just make the assumption that a bubble means a room. You could have multiple bubbles within a room. You could have a bubble that's outside. It's just some area where the player is required to do something in order to progress. So in each bubble, try to answer the following questions, right? What purpose does the space serve? What does the player do in this area? What actions occur in this space? So like, what mechanics am I using? Do I use the grav null? Is there a collectible to obtain? What gameplay actions does the player perform? Also, you're going to give each bubble a time estimate, kind of like you see here. Here's an example bubble. So just an estimate, how long do you want the player to spend in this particular area, right? We know that the levels should take roughly 4 minutes to complete. So use that as a currency when you're planning out your level. So I want the player to spend 30 seconds in the generator room. I want them to spend 15 seconds with the crane and all these different things, right? And just rough estimates for now. So then when you go ahead and try to plan this out a little bit better, you see all of those spaces and you see those time estimates. And we will get those more exact as we go forward. And another thing before I get into the notes about the bubble is you'll see, this image in the background. So each bubble you create should have at least one reference image connected with it, about what you want to actually make, or what you want that area to look like. So focus on environmental images. Notice how I'm not just showing a picture of a generator with a white background. It's a generator set in an environment. This is going to help you for then like looking to see how you can create like a window. Noticing the distance between the windows, how high the window is up from the ground. Notice how the generator itself is modular. So you can see this main turbine, you see this little railing coming off and this little, looks like a motor here, and it's the same, right? So we can identify the modularity and then recreate these in Unity, and that's exactly what you'll be doing in level design. So the more reference images you gather now, the easier level design will be for you and the better experience you'll have. I promise you that. And the better your level will turn out. Because rather than pulling everything from your head and what you remember, you have reference images and really can start to analyze some of those things I was just mentioning. And notice the modularity. Like this railing's the same, so you make one, turn it into a prefab, and just copy it over here, and then use it in your level for other things as well. So make sure each bubble has a reference image attached to it. And then lastly, the note numbers. So the notes are a really big part of it. It's like, you know, half of it is the actual layout, half of it is the actual written notes explaining what the player is doing. So you'll see in here, basically, note 15, once they get in there, we get a cue saying that the generator needs to be activated and it needs a new fuse. So then note 16 explains that they search the area for the fuse, they find it with the grabnol, pick it up, carry it over to the generator, it snaps in place, and then electricity is restored. All right, and then they're able to advance and use the crane from there. So any icons, you'll see the icons we provide to you. Feel free to include any of those in your bubbles. Really what that's to do is to help signify when you get to the map, you know that those icons need to be placed somewhere in that area of the map itself. So definitely include your IPM icons, which mechanic you're using. Include a checkpoint if you're hitting checkpoints. These are like physics objects for things you need to like pick up and use with the grabnol. And then these are different types of collectibles. We're going to talk more about collectibles next week when we talk about the map. But you can use as many icons as you want for the planning of your bubble diagram. All right, so once you have these bubbles created, we then need to connect them together. So there's two ways we can do so. We can do so using a two-way transition, allowing the player to go back and forth between the bubbles. Like once they unlock the transition, they're able to go back and forth. Or a one-way transition, which once it activates, it cuts off progression and they can't go backwards. So anyone that's joining me live, can you guys come up with either an example of a two-way transition or an example of a one-way transition? Maybe either something really cliche that you've seen in the past from games or something you could think of for a scraps level. Any example of a two-way or one-way transition in an existing game you've played or something that you could create on your own. Give you guys a minute to answer that. All right, so Sully says a one-way could be an easy teleporter at the end of a dungeon. Okay, so like you get through a dungeon, maybe in a game like Torchlight or Diablo, and once you finish it, you go into the teleporter and it like brings you back to the main town area. Right? Good. Yeah, that's definitely an example of a one-way transition. So wouldn't a two-way be a doorway? Yeah, if the door can be opened and it stays open, definitely. Yeah, that's a two-way transition. So now if you walk up to the door and you open it, and once you walk through it, the door shuts behind you, that would be a one-way transition, right? Because you're not able to actually go back. So it's a good idea to have some one-way transition strategically placed in your level. By doing that, that prevents players from wandering and getting lost and backtracking, right? Imagine that the level's all two-way transitions. They get to the very end and they're like, wait a minute, do I need something from the beginning? And they just turn around and walk all the way to the back just to find out that no, they don't need anything over there at all, right? So things like that can help keep the player on track and keep them progressing. So remember, game design is all about interaction, so try to tie some type of interaction to your transitions. Even if it's just something that's blocking the way the player needs to crouch under, or something they need to jump over. You need to stack up crates with the grab null and jump to get to a higher location. Anything is better than just holding W and walking forward. So try to come up with small interactions using those core mechanics, those core actions to give the player something to do, right? Jump over a gap, duck under something, throw something with the grab null, or move something out of the way. Anything is better than just walking forward. So I also challenge you to be creative with this and try to add verticality into your transitions. Adding height into your level presents a lot of interesting challenges when designing it, and also leaves a better experience to the player if they can climb up things and drop down. So it doesn't have to be a full-blown like 3-story level or multiple floors. You could do something simple as like having a warehouse and there's a catwalk. So there's a certain point where you climb up the catwalk to get over a barrier and then drop down the other side, right? Or maybe you're on a balcony and there's a crate and you push the crate off the edge to create a pathway, and then you can jump down to the lower area. So small interactions like that to connect your bubbles from one to the next. So we like to use, I'm actually going to change this on the fly. We like to use the term minor setups, which are just using the core actions. We had a meeting over summer break and we tried to clarify all of our terminology across all the classes. So using some type of core action to create some type of small gameplay setup, allowing the player to do something, right? So here's just a few examples of those. If anyone played the Scraps training grounds, or even the small little outpost area, the small little setups there, those are the types of things we want to see. So there's a toxic spill, you use the grab null to grab some pallets and place them in the toxic waste and then jump across. The only mechanics we're using there are the grab null and jumping. Those are the only actions to create some gameplay scenario. So this one's directly from the Scraps training grounds, where there's a piece of catwalk. You use the grab null to slide it out, and then that allows you to make the jump across and get a collectible. Right, so small interactions like that to keep the gameplay up, keep the player doing something in between using your mechanics. All right, so here's just an example of a transition, or you can see multiple different transitions here. So here we have 2 bubbles, and then in between there's an arrow, right? So this one-way arrow just represents a one-way transition versus the two-way, obviously a two-way transition where you can go back and forth. So I encourage everybody, this isn't in the instructions, but it does help plan out things better if you include note numbers on your transitions, as well as some type of icon as a way to symbolize what the action is. So there you can see that arrow, so I have to jump. If you want to use if you have to use the grab null for something, you can use the little physics object and place it there. There's one for crouch if you want to crouch, and as well as you can make some of your own, which we will talk about as well. So basically between these 2 areas of the level, there's a big glass window. The player needs to pick up an object and throw it through the window to break it, and then they can jump through that broken window to get back down to the factory floor. All right, so between each bubble, you should have some type of transition. All right, next up, I'm going to talk about literal key and lock setups. All right, so what we want to stay away from in Scraps, and I'll definitely be looking out for these when I go over the LDDs today, is an actual physical key that the player picks up and collects. So why we want to stay away from that is because keys, like actual physical keys, they'd have to be small, right? Because we want Scraps to be set in a realistic type setting or a modern day setting. So it'd have to be realistic to the size it is, which is pretty small. Also, it's been done a bunch of times before. So it's been done several times before. Pick up the blue key, open the blue door. Pick up the red key, open the red door. We want to try and come up with something a bit more interesting and more immersive here in the game design program. And then lastly, it's an everyday task. Does anyone have fun when they lose their keys? Because I definitely don't. It stresses me out. So instead, let's do something that the player doesn't get to do in everyday life, right? Like using explosives or driving a truck through a wall, or things that you're not able to actually do and push the boundaries of what's fun in the game engine. So let's see if we can come up with some metaphorical alternatives. So now that I'm telling you no physical keys and collecting them, does anybody have any suggestions as what we could do instead? Instead of an actual literal key that you pick up. Going once. Oh, Sully, would riddles suffice? So, how would the player actually interact with it? Like, what's the so for scraps? There's a few specific things we want to stay away from, like adding new UI elements. But explain how you would actually want it to function. And I'm also thinking on the lines of like collectible items, like some item that you pick up and then use somewhere in the level. Like it goes into your inventory and you walk up to somewhere else and then press E. Whoops, got ahead of myself. All right, so Tiana says coins. Okay, so you pick up the coin, and then what happens? All right, cool. Sully, I like where you're going with that, a broken crank. So for both of you guys, for Tiana, what do you do with the coins? And Sully, what do you do with the broken crank? Because another thing for scraps, and I know this is, started to be a different way of thinking, is we want to understand why. So when you you go to collect an item. I see this happens very commonly. You collect an item, and now that the item's in your inventory, the door is just open now. But why does that work? We really like to have the player use the item from the inventory. So use the coins to buy a key and unlock a door. All right, good. So like maybe they go up to a vending machine and pick and buy some items. So you use the word key. That's the one part we want to avoid. That's what we're trying to get around. But that's the right concept. So you collect a coin, maybe you put it in a vending machine, and it gives you some item to unlock a door. But try to think of other things besides that literal key that the item is you're getting. So Sully said like a broken crank. That makes me think of like there's gears that you collect. You collect the gears and you put them into a small gearbox. And once you find them all and use the crank, that turns the gears and now the door opens. So pick up an object and place it to block a laser to open a door. Yeah, that's great. Yeah, so there's a physical laser. Maybe the laser is hitting like a button, and the button is keeping the door shut, and you put an object in front of it that blocks it. Good. That's definitely something outside of the collectibles, but still totally a good solution. So a few things we want to stay away from might be the things you might think of first. No one mentioned them, which I'm happy to see, but something like a crowbar would be more of like a skeleton key. That's what we want to stay away from. Is like I pick up the crowbar and now all doors are unlocked. Try to think of individual situations where there's something they need to collect for each scenario. And the other would be a key card, right? So this would be along the lines of thinking like, oh, the first thing I thought of was a key card, so I'm going to go with that. But that oftentimes has a lot of similar issues to the key, right? It'd have to be small, like the size of a credit card. It is commonly used as an alternative, and we want to come up with things that are a little bit more immersive. So one being explosives. Explosives are a good way to make things a little bit more exciting and still functions the same way, right? So collect the item, it goes into your inventory, and then when you go to use it, it's just checking to see if you have that item. So these are all things we're going to teach you throughout these upcoming months, how to use our inventory system so you know how to check to see if you have an item in there. And then it's just about what you can come up with and what that item is. So really the only difference between all these objects are what it actually looks like, right? Or what it's actually doing in the world and how it's interacting with other objects. Because it could be a key, it could be a stick of dynamite, it could be a key card. It's all going to function the same, but the immersion of it is what can change from object to object. Speaking of immersion, don't forget we're making a game here, so you can do things that are from a video game, right? So yeah, exactly, Sully. The application is what matters, how you're using the object. And think about, does it make sense to the player? Like, does this actually make sense? Like, why this is opening a door or why this is turning off a force field, something like that. Another example I've seen in the past was like body parts and limbs. So I had a student level that was set in basically the Bastion had hired the scientists to work on Gravnol components, and the scientist ended up going rogue and shutting himself off from the Bastions. So they had a scrapper go in and investigate the scientist's lab and see what he was working on. So he gets into the lab and he sees that the office to the lab is locked with a retina scanner. So the player has to go find the dead scientist and basically take his head with the grabnol and rip it off and hold it in front of the eye scanner. Works just like a key, but it was a much more memorable experience, right? It was kind of goopy and a little dark at the same time, but it was a much more memorable experience than pick up a key, open a door, right? But in reality, it worked the same way. So definitely a lot of different options here. Like if you played the Scraps Training Grounds, you saw those little orbs. You pick up the orbs and insert them into the stations. That's definitely what we're looking for, the type of things we're trying to reproduce rather than picking up a key to open a door. Any questions at all up until this point? All right. If not, I'm going to keep going, but feel free to post any question you guys have in the chat. I'll definitely get to those. So this bubble diagram here is included in the assignment. You can take a look at this as an example to what it is we're looking for. So a few things I want to point out that are done really well in this bubble diagram are the overall pacing of everything, as well as the time estimates. And the note numbers. Those are things I oftentimes see missed, are like the time estimates and the note numbers. So you'll notice with the note numbers that everything's in sequence. It goes 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, back in here, 19, and 20. So you'll see that note is always, the note number is always adjacent to the following number. So start in order, right, and go through what the player's doing in each space. One thing you'll see different between the generator room and the factory floor is there's 2 note numbers in here. All right, so if you want the player to backtrack through your level or you want them to return to a bubble, they should be doing so for some purpose. There should be some reason why they're going back. So in this level, basically you enter the factory, you get all the way to the factory floor 2, you get to this zone, and you see the crane is broken, right? The crane is broken down, it needs to be powered on because there's a big pipe that's blocking this hallway, right? And that's where we need to get into and open up the main office to accomplish the goal. So the first time we come in here, it's to communicate to the player the crane is broken, that needs to be fixed. In games, we always try to present the player with a problem first before we show them where the solution is. So then when the player sees that, they adventure off through the level, they come into the generator room and power on the crane, and then there's a nice one-way transition to jump back down to the factory floor 2. So you'll see in here it says first visit, second visit. This should just be a time estimate explaining how long you're expecting the player to take the first time they come in and how long you're expecting them to take the second time. So if you want to have a level with a main centralized like hub, Like maybe the player enters and they see a big generator and there's like 5 things that are broken on it, and they go off to one part of the level, get the thing, come back, go to the second part, get the thing, come back, and just rinse and repeat, and you want like this main central area, you'd have a note number for every single time the player comes back and explain what they're doing in that space. If you're just having the player go through a bubble just for the sake of getting somewhere else, try to adjust the flow of things. Try to eliminate that from happening. We don't want the player walking through spaces that they've already seen without experiencing something new. So if you want the player to, quote unquote, backtrack through your level, they should be seeing new gameplay every step of the way. Up until they hit that player finish, they should be progressing and seeing new gameplay interactions. So that doesn't mean you can't reuse the same space. There should just be something new about that when they come back. All right. Another awesome thing that this was Anthony Lauder's diagram. Another thing he did really nice was how he formatted different things. So these factory floor bubbles, these represent areas that are affected by a sandstorm. So like in the valve room, I have to shut the valves off to close the vents in the ceiling to allow the player to progress. You don't have to include damage volumes in your level like this, but he did some nice things with formatting, as well as the stairs in the generator room. You can see they're different colors. This is signifying they're on different heights. So depending how you want to add verticality to your level, it might change. You might have a level where bubbles are stacked on top of each other, versus here in Anthony's, the generator room is actually just overlooking the factory floor. They're not directly on top of each other, more of just offset in different heights. So let me jump over to the assignment real quick. So in the assignment, assign tasks, build a diagram. All right, so a few things I want to point out in the assignment itself. First are these 2 articles right here. So one is an architect's perspective on level design, and the other is a beginner's guide to designing video game levels. So you'll see these 2 different articles here. We'll talk about a similar process. This is all about a guy that went to school, graduated to become an architect, realized he doesn't want to be an architect, and ended up working as a level designer. So this is his progress and his experience working on specifically Star Wars Bounty Hunter, and the process he goes through when designing levels. So you'll see that this should look familiar into what we're doing, right? So research before you design, that's like reading the creative vision, understanding the constraints, know the technical specs for the project. Brainstorm and come up with ideas, right? Take those ideas and formulate a level design document, right? So you're at that point now. Now you're getting to the point where we're going to start planning out the level and the flow and to actually start building some bubble diagrams, all right? And then that transitions into actually taking the bubble diagram and making a map. So a beginner's guide to designing video game levels will show you that same, general workflow, just a different perspective on it. Just to show you that what we're teaching you here in this class isn't just my own process I came up with. This is something that's in the industry that's used, whether it's making a game for, like in here you see Skylanders and Ratchet and Clank, or if it's for like Star Wars Bounty Hunter, or if you're making a game for a level for Scraps or a level for Angry Birds, you can take this same structure and then make a finished level for that game. All right, so check those out. Hopefully you get some insight from them. I definitely find those real interesting. As well as when we come down here, I have this little diagram I want to explain about ways you can communicate verticality in your level. So how Anthony was doing it, the bubbles never actually overlap. But say you want to make a level where multiple floors are are in the same space. So in this, for example, we enter, we go into the lobby, then from there we go into the warehouse, and let me just make sure. Okay, you should be able to see my cursor now as I'm hovering. All right, so when we go into here, this warehouse, this bubble is actually going to signify the first floor of the warehouse, the second floor of the warehouse, and the transition between them. So maybe I take an elevator to get from the first floor to the second floor, or I take a set of stairs. Maybe there's a little gap in the floor where I stack boxes and jump up to it. All of that detail would be included in the notes for this general bubble. And then this office would be on the actual second floor, but connected off of this. So a layout like this is actually showing us the physical layout of where floor 2 is going to be, or where the office is going to be on the second floor. This one down below, there we go. All right, this one down below, we have the entrance, and then the floor 1 of the lobby, just like we did up top. And now this one's broken up a bit differently. So notice that this shows the exact same information as the above image, but one thing slightly different. This one is broken up, floor 1 and floor 2 are broken up into separate bubbles, and there's a different arrow in between them. So this is a vertical transition between those two floors. So in reality, we would take this floor and actually drag it and drop it over here, and then the office is going to exist somewhere over here in 3D space when we get to that point. But this at least lets you show the details. What's floor 1 going to look like? What's the transition in between? And then what's floor 2 look like? And then again, this will be moved when you actually move it and build it in 3D. So either way you want to communicate height, you can do either one of these ways, or how Anthony has it, where he doesn't actually have the levels overlap at any point. But I challenge you to try to add some height and some verticality to your level. It definitely adds a challenge when trying to design and plan this, trying to portray 3D space in a 2D image, as well as just makes the level a bit more interesting to actually play through. So rather than just walking on the ground floor all at the same time, you're going up, you're dropping down, and there's a lot more you can do when you think about that third dimension. So check out this bubble diagram. You'll see it is definitely helpful to build the map. So here's just a few takeaways from the architect's guide, an architect's perspective on level design. So he just kind of breaks down the process, and just to kind of highlight what you guys will be doing. And these are all direct quotes right from that article. So first, you're going to draw out some of these diagrams to see if you can start to see the general layout of your level. All right, so just draw a few of these. If you want to sketch them on paper and pencil, or you want to just build a few quickly in Google Draw, don't worry about adding the notes and the details. Just draw the bubbles, add in some arrows, and see if you can see the flow of the level starting to take place. Then from there, start adjusting some circles and adjust some of the actual bubbles. So for right now, I want all of your areas in your levels to just be a circle. Don't make them square, don't make them hexagons or different shapes. Just make them all circles and arrows for now. Then when you're starting to be happy and you see the shape of the level, start to make some bigger and smaller. So like going back to like Anthony's, for example, his warehouse areas were much larger than, say, his hallways, right? So if it's a smaller space, we want to make a smaller bubble versus a larger space with a bigger bubble. That being said, if you're having bigger spaces, like you have a big bubble like this one up here, there should be an adequate amount of gameplay in those bigger spaces. So just keep that in mind. If you're having bigger areas, don't make them big just for the sense of making it large. We want there to be a proportionate amount of gameplay. And then finally, I really like this quote from the article, is that anyone should be able to look at the diagram and see what you're trying to do with your level, but most importantly, so should you. The point of doing this is to making the map itself, like what you see here, an easier process. So you're able to go from this rough starting point to the map, where things will be adjusted, but you can see the overall flow and the overall shape. So keep that in mind as you're building your bubble diagram. This is for you to help you make your map much easier. So here is like the same imagery of like the Tulsa Zoo, but shown with Anthony's map from when he was a student. Here is the bubble diagram. And now here you can see this is the first pass at his map. So here we can literally just take the bubbles. Okay, factory entry, what does that look like? All right, let's draw that, and we got that little shape. All right, hallway, what does that look like? Here's that hallway. And now puzzle room, what's the puzzle room look like? And you draw that and get that being how you want it, and start to connect them together. All right, so you can see how these bubbles are signified and shown in the actual map. Right, their shape changes, but the overall size is what is being represented. And then there you can see the final pass of the map as he started to add in more details and things like that. And we're going to go over a plan of attack for how you can turn your bubble diagram into your map in the upcoming weeks. All right, so hopefully that gives you a sense as what the bubble diagram is all about and what its purpose is. If you finish up with it, or you get to a point where you're happy with how it's coming along, definitely don't skip over this step. I have this step here in the bubble diagram, as well as I have the same instructions in the level design map, because you could do this any number of times. You could do this at the end of the bubble diagram. You could do this halfway through the map to really just test what it is you're making. So this will walk you through saving your image, bringing it into Unity, and projecting it using your map projector. And then you can actually, quote unquote, play your level without having to actually build anything. So you can use your phone or use a website to set a timer and actually run through the level like you're playing it. So if you get to a hallway and you're supposed to jump over a gap, jump over the gap, right? Just simulate like you're playing the level and see if you can visualize the space. So if you see you go and bring into Unity and some of your bubbles are way too big, then you might want to go back and resize them and readjust, right? If some of them are too small, make them bigger. If they're too far apart, et cetera, and get the overall size to a happy spot before you start to go into the map. So if you get finished with your bubble diagram early, or if you make even just a few bubbles and you want to see what it's looking like in Unity, you can definitely do this process any number of times. All right. So any questions about what we covered? I know, Chelsea, you've got an issue, and we're going to get that tackled. But does anyone have any questions about the content or about the bubble diagram or the control station or anything from the week 2 content? Let me go back over to the calendar. All right, so Kimberly, you've got a question about the wind turbine. So if there's no other questions, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go ahead and stop the recording.